Dr. Maya Richardson stood at gate A7 of Atlanta International Airport, her Louis Vuitton carry-on positioned neatly beside her. The early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a golden glow across her deep brown skin. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of proving herself in operating rooms and hospital boardrooms. Today's first-class ticket to Los Angeles wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. In less than 24 hours, she would need to be steady and focused to perform a delicate brain surgery on a 10-year-old patient. The 6-hour flight would give her time to review the case files and get some much-needed rest. As the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Maya gathered her belongings. Her crisp white blazer and tailored black pants reflected her meticulous nature, while her natural hair was styled in elegant twisted locks that spoke to her pride in her heritage. She had earned her seat in first class, just as she had earned her position as one of the country's top neurosurgeons. Walking down the jet bridge, Maya thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to put her through medical school. "Hold your head high," her mother always said, "but keep your heart humble." Those words had guided her through countless challenging situations, and today would be no different. The flight attendant at the aircraft door, a young woman named Sarah, greeted Maya with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Richardson. You're in 2A, just to your left." Maya nodded appreciatively and made her way to her seat. The first-class cabin was gradually filling with the usual mix of business travelers and wealthy tourists. A older white man in an expensive suit barely glanced up from his newspaper as she passed. A young couple, absorbed in their phones, paid her no attention. As she stored her carry-on in the overhead compartment, Maya noticed Captain James Barrett doing his pre-flight cabin walkthrough. He was tall, probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the cockpit. She watched as he stopped to chat with passengers in first class. He shook hands with the businessman, joked with the young couple about their honeymoon plans, and even knelt down to give a small boy a plastic set of pilot's wings. But when he reached Maya's row, his warm demeanor suddenly shifted. His eyes swept past her as if she were invisible. No greeting, no acknowledgement, not even the professional courtesy he had shown to every other passenger in first class. The contrast was so stark that Sarah, the flight attendant who had greeted Maya earlier, noticed it too. A slight frown crossed her face as she arranged bottles in the galley. Maya took a deep breath and opened her laptop, determined not to let the incident affect her. She had just pulled up her patient's latest MRI scans when she felt a presence looming over her. "Excuse me," Captain Barrett's voice was clipped and formal, nothing like the friendly tone he had used with other passengers. "I need to see your boarding pass." Maya looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. Around them, conversations quieted as other passengers turned to watch. Not a single other person in first class had been asked to show their boarding pass after already being seated. "Of course," Maya replied calmly, though she could feel her heart beginning to race. She reached for her purse and produced the boarding pass, holding it out with a steady hand. Captain Barrett snatched it from her fingers, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. He turned it over, held it up to the light, and frowned as if searching for signs of forgery. The silence in the cabin grew heavier with each passing second. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Maya's voice was level, professional, the same tone she used when dealing with difficult colleagues in the operating room. "Just making sure everything is in order," he replied, his emphasis on the last 2 words carrying an unmistakable edge. "We've had issues with people trying to sit where they don't belong." A few seats away, the businessman who had ignored Maya earlier lowered his newspaper, his expression uncomfortable. The young couple exchanged glances. Sarah, the flight attendant, had stopped her preparations and was watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Maya felt a familiar weight settle in her stomach, the weight of yet another moment where she had to navigate someone else's prejudice while maintaining her dignity. But as she sat there, her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Hold your head high, but keep your heart humble." Little did Captain Barrett know, this interaction would be the beginning of a story that would soon capture national attention and force a long-overdue conversation about discrimination in the airline industry. The uncomfortable scene in first class continued as Captain Barrett held Maya's boarding pass like it was evidence in a crime investigation. Other passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, the atmosphere growing more tense with each passing moment. Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped forward with purpose. Captain Barrett, I personally checked Dr. Richardson's boarding pass at the door. She's absolutely in her correct seat. Her voice was professional but firm, making it clear she wouldn't stand by silently. The captain's jaw tightened. He thrust the boarding pass back at Maya, not quite making eye contact. Well, these days we can't be too careful about making sure people are in their proper places. The emphasis he placed on proper places made his meaning crystal clear. Maya accepted her boarding pass with steady hands, though her heart was pounding. As a successful black woman, she had faced similar situations before, in medical school, in hospitals, and now here. But this felt different, more blatant, more public. An elderly white woman across the aisle spoke up unexpectedly. I've been flying first class for 30 years, she said loudly, and I've never once been asked to show my boarding pass after being seated. Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Captain Barrett's face reddened slightly. Instead of apologizing, he straightened his uniform jacket and declared, "I'm just following security protocols." Then he turned and strode toward the cockpit, his back stiff with barely contained anger. As other passengers continued boarding, Maya noticed people stealing glances at her. Some offered sympathetic smiles, while others quickly looked away when caught staring. She pulled out her phone and began documenting the incident in detail, including the time, date, and exact words used. Sarah returned to Maya's seat with a glass of water she hadn't requested. "I'm so sorry about that, Dr. Richardson," she whispered. "I'd never seen him act this way before. Would you like me to get you the customer relations contact information?" Maya thanked her quietly. "Yes, please. And Sarah? Would you be willing to write down what you witnessed if needed?" The young flight attendant nodded firmly. "Absolutely. What he did wasn't right." A businessman 2 rows ahead turned around in his seat. "Ma'am, I filmed the whole interaction on my phone. If you need it, I'd be happy to send it to you. I'm a corporate lawyer, and what just happened was textbook discrimination." The young couple from earlier chimed in as well. "We'll be happy to be witnesses too," the woman offered. "My sister works for the ACLU. This kind of behavior can't go unchallenged." Maya felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, anger at having to deal with this situation, and determination to ensure it didn't happen to anyone else. She was used to being the only black person in many professional spaces, but she had earned every achievement through hard work and excellence. As the final passengers boarded, Maya could see Captain Barrett in the cockpit through the open door. He was talking animatedly to his co-pilot, occasionally gesturing toward the cabin with sharp movements. The co-pilot's expression was uncomfortable, and he kept shaking his head slightly. Sarah returned with a discreet note containing contact information for the airline's corporate offices and her own details as a witness. "The other flight attendants and I will back you up completely," she assured Maya. "We documented everything in our flight log." Maya took a deep breath and centered herself. She had a critical surgery tomorrow, and she needed to stay focused on that. Opening her laptop again, she began reviewing her patient's files, but her mind kept returning to the incident. Years of medical training had taught her to document everything meticulously. She opened a new document and began typing out every detail while it was fresh in her memory: the captain's body language, his exact words, the reactions of other passengers, the times and sequence of events. As the cabin door closed and the safety demonstration began, Maya noticed something interesting. Captain Barrett's usual pre-flight announcement, typically warm and welcoming, was noticeably curt. His voice carried an edge of tension that everyone could hear. The young couple exchanged knowing looks. The elderly woman across the aisle shook her head disapprovingly. The businessman who had filmed the incident was already typing what looked like an email to someone about what he had witnessed. What Captain Barrett didn't realize was that his actions had united the first-class cabin in an unexpected way. Instead of intimidating or isolating Maya, he had inadvertently created a cabin full of allies ready to stand up against discrimination. As the plane began to taxi, Maya knew this flight would be just the beginning of something much bigger. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Maya tried to focus on her patient's medical files, but the tension in the cabin remained palpable. Every time Captain Barrett's voice came over the intercom, it carried an unmistakable edge of hostility. An hour into the flight, Sarah approached Maya with a fresh cup of coffee. "Dr. Richardson," she said quietly, I thought you should know that some of the other passengers have already sent emails to the airline's corporate office. They're not waiting until we land." Maya nodded, touched by the support but wishing none of this was necessary. She had spent years perfecting her surgical techniques, not fighting discrimination at 35,000 feet. Just then, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the cabin to shake slightly. Captain Barrett's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, especially our legitimate first-class passengers, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The emphasis on legitimate was unmistakable, and several passengers turned to look at Maya with expressions of shock. The elderly woman across the aisle, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Peterson, couldn't contain herself any longer. "In all my years of flying," she announced loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear, "I have never witnessed such unprofessional behavior from a pilot. It's disgraceful." The businessman who had filmed the earlier incident was already on his laptop, typing furiously. "I'm adding this new comment to my report," he said. "The pattern of behavior is clear and documented." Maya remained composed, though her hands had tightened slightly around her coffee cup. She had faced discrimination before, but never so brazenly, and never from someone responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers. Sarah returned to Maya's seat, her face showing concern. "Dr. Richardson, the other flight attendants, and I have been documenting everything. Captain Barrett's behavior is getting worse, not better. We've already contacted our union representative about this." The young couple who had offered to be witnesses earlier were now openly recording every announcement the captain made. "We're timestamping everything," the wife explained. "My sister at the ACLU says documentation is crucial in cases like this." As if on cue, Captain Barrett emerged from the cockpit for what he claimed was a routine cabin check. He walked through first class, warmly greeting every passenger except Maya. When he reached her row, he paused and spoke loudly to Sarah. "Make sure all passengers in this section have their seat assignments double-checked before landing. We wouldn't want any confusion about where people belong." The co-pilot, who had come out to use the restroom, overheard this and visibly winced. He caught Maya's eye and shook his head slightly, as if apologizing for his colleague's behavior. By now, other passengers from business class had heard about the situation. A black executive from tech company 2 rows back came forward during a smooth patch of flying. "Dr. Richardson, I'm Marcus Williams from Google. This happened to me last year on a different airline. I fought it and won. Here's my card. Let me know if you need any support." Maya accepted his card gracefully, adding it to the growing collection of contact information from supportive passengers. She was a doctor, trained to remain calm in high-pressure situations, but this was testing her limits. Sarah returned again, this time with surprising news. "Dr. Richardson, you should know that several passengers have been tweeting about this situation using the plane's Wi-Fi. It's starting to get attention online. The airline's social media team has already reached out to our crew for details." The elderly Mrs. Peterson leaned across the aisle. "My grandson just texted me that he's seen the tweets. He works for CNN and wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to them after we land." Maya took a deep breath, considering her options. She had a critical surgery tomorrow and hadn't planned on becoming the center of a viral story about discrimination. But as she looked around at the concerned and supportive faces in the cabin, she realized this was bigger than just her. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Captain Barrett's voice came over the intercom again, this time with barely concealed anger. "All passengers need to stay in their assigned seats. We don't want anyone getting ideas about moving to areas where they don't belong." The co-pilot, returning to the cockpit, stopped briefly by Maya's seat. In a low voice, he said, "Ma'am, I want you to know that his views don't represent this airline. Some of us are counting the days until his retirement." As the flight continued toward Los Angeles, it was becoming clear that this journey would have consequences far beyond a simple first-class ticket dispute. The real turbulence, it seemed, was yet to come. Halfway through the flight, the situation in first class had evolved into something unprecedented. Maya's row had become an impromptu command center for what passengers were now calling Operation Accountability. The businessman, who had introduced himself as Richard Thompson from a major law firm, was coordinating with his office via the in-flight Wi-Fi. "My partners are already drafting a preliminary legal brief," he informed Maya. "The airline's history of similar incidents will be relevant." Sarah had been discreetly gathering statements from other crew members during her routine service. She slipped Maya another note. The other flight attendants have documented 6 separate inappropriate comments from Captain Barrett in just 3 hours. We've never seen anything like this. The plane entered another patch of turbulence, more severe this time. Captain Barrett's voice came over the intercom, dripping with barely concealed contempt. "This is your captain speaking. All passengers must remain in their assigned seats, their proper assigned seats. We don't want any misunderstandings during this rough patch." The co-pilot, who had been increasingly uncomfortable with his superior's behavior, made an unusual move. He came out of the cockpit and approached Maya directly, speaking in a low voice. "Dr. Richardson, I'm First Officer David Chen. I want to formally apologize for my colleague's behavior. I've already contacted our chief pilot on the ground about this situation." Maya maintained her professional composure, but inside, she was cataloging every incident with the same precision she used in the operating room. Her phone now contained detailed notes, timestamps, and witness statements from nearly everyone in first class. Mrs. Peterson, who had been quietly fuming for hours, suddenly produced a surprising revelation. "My late husband was on the airline's board of directors," she announced. "I just got off the phone with his former colleague who's still there. They're taking this very seriously." The young couple, Amy and James, had been busy on social media. "Dr. Richardson," Amy said, showing Maya her phone, "the hashtag respect in the skies is trending. People are sharing similar stories from other flights. You're not alone in this." Marcus Williams, the tech executive from business class, made another visit forward. "The tech community is rallying behind this," he reported. "Several major influencers are picking up the story. The airline's PR team is going to have a busy night." Just then, Captain Barrett made another round through the cabin, this time with a flight log in hand. He stopped at Maya's seat, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I hope there haven't been any more seating irregularities. We take protocol very seriously on this aircraft." Before Maya could respond, Mrs. Peterson stood up, her voice clear and commanding. "James Barrett, I knew your father when he flew for this airline. You would be ashamed of your behavior today, absolutely ashamed." The captain's face reddened, but before he could reply, First Officer Chen appeared again. "Captain, we have a call from ground control. They need to speak with you immediately." The way he emphasized immediately suggested this wasn't a routine communication. As Barrett stormed back to the cockpit, Sarah approached with fresh coffee and a surprising update. "Dr. Richardson, our union representative has been in contact with airline headquarters. They're meeting about this situation right now while we're still in the air." The businessman, Richard, looked up from his laptop with a satisfied expression. "The airline's legal department has already reached out to my firm. They're requesting all documentation of today's events." Maya finally allowed herself a small smile. She had faced discrimination before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't fighting alone. An entire community had formed around her, united in their determination to see justice served. The plane began its initial descent into Los Angeles, and Captain Barrett's final announcement was noticeably subdued. Gone was the hostile tone, replaced by a mechanical reading of standard landing procedures. First Officer Chen made one last visit before returning to the cockpit for landing. "Dr. Richardson, there will be some airline representatives meeting us at the gate. They've requested to speak with you, if you're willing." As the plane descended through the clouds over Los Angeles, Maya reviewed her notes one final time. Tomorrow, she would perform life-saving surgery on a child. But today, she had inadvertently become part of something bigger, a moment of collective stand against discrimination that would have lasting implications for the airline industry. The real confrontation, she knew, was still to come. But looking around at the supportive faces in the cabin, Maya felt ready for whatever awaited her at the gate. As the plane began its final approach into Los Angeles International Airport, the first-class cabin buzzed with quiet anticipation. Maya's phone had been filling up with contact information, witness statements, and time-stamped documentation of every incident during the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Barrett's voice crackled over the intercom, noticeably subdued now. "We're beginning our final descent into Los Angeles. All passengers should return to their assigned seating areas immediately." Sarah, who had been an unwavering ally throughout the flight, leaned down to whisper to Maya, "There are 3 airline executives waiting at the gate. This has gone straight to the top." The businessman, Richard Thompson, was still working on his laptop until the last possible moment. "My firm has handled discrimination cases before," he said, closing his computer. "I've never seen one unfold in real time like this. The documentation is extraordinary." Through the cabin window, Maya could see the sprawling lights of Los Angeles spreading out below. Her thoughts briefly turned to tomorrow's surgery, a delicate procedure on a young patient that would require all her focus and skill. But first, she had another kind of operation to complete. As the plane touched down, Mrs. Peterson reached across the aisle to pat Maya's hand. "My dear, you've handled this with such grace. My husband would have been proud to see passengers and crew coming together like this." The young couple, Amy and James, showed Maya their phones one last time. The story had exploded on social media, with multiple news outlets picking it up. #Respect in Theskies had become the top trending topic in several cities. When the plane reached the gate, First Officer Chen made an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated momentarily. We have a special procedure for deplaning today." Captain Barrett emerged from the cockpit, his face tight with suppressed emotion. He seemed shocked to see several passengers holding up their phones, still recording. The contrast between his earlier arrogance and current discomfort was striking. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and professional. "Dr. Richardson, the airline representatives would like to speak with you first, if you're willing. They're waiting in the jet bridge." Maya gathered her belongings with deliberate calm. The businessman handed her his business card. "My team will be standing by. Don't sign anything without legal review." As Maya stood to leave, something unexpected happened. The entire first-class cabin, along with several passengers from business class, stood up in solidarity. Mrs. Peterson started it, then the young couple, then Richard Thompson, and soon everyone was on their feet. Captain Barrett, forced to watch this display, seemed to shrink in his perfectly pressed uniform. The co-pilot, First Officer Chen, stepped away from him pointedly and gave Maya a respectful nod. At the aircraft door, Sarah handed Maya one final note. "It's a complete list of every incident, signed by all crew members except the captain. We're standing with you, Dr. Richardson." As Maya stepped into the jet bridge, she found herself facing 3 airline executives in crisp suits, their expressions grave. Behind them, she could see news cameras already gathering at the gate. Dr. Richardson, the most senior-looking executive, stepped forward. "We want to sincerely apologize for your experience today. We've been monitoring the situation since it first started trending on social media." Maya straightened her shoulders, channeling the same confidence she brought to her operating room. "I appreciate that," she said firmly, "but this isn't just about one flight or one passenger. This is about systemic change." The executives exchanged glances as passengers began deplaning behind Maya. Each one who passed offered a supportive word or gesture. The young couple paused to take a final photo. Mrs. Peterson made sure the executives saw her writing down their names. Marcus Williams, the tech executive, emerged last. "Dr. Richardson, the tech community is ready to amplify this story. Change doesn't just happen. Sometimes it needs a push." As Maya prepared to walk into the terminal and face the waiting media, she felt a complex mix of emotions. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, but now that it was here, she would use it wisely. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Hold your head high, but keep your heart humble." Looking at the growing crowd by the gate, Maya knew this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to take flight. The airline executives gestured toward a private room, but Maya shook her head. "Whatever you have to say," she stated clearly, "can be said in front of everyone who witnessed this today." The time for private conversations about public discrimination was over. The private terminal room at LAX had transformed into an impromptu hearing. Maya sat at one end of a long table, surrounded by her newfound allies from the flight, facing 3 airline executives and their legal team. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Sarah, still in her flight attendant uniform, stood at attention near the door. She had refused to leave, stating firmly that the crew needed to be represented. First Officer Chen sat quietly in the corner, his presence a silent testament against his captain's actions. "Allegations." Mrs. Peterson interrupted sharply from her seat beside Maya. We all witnessed it. There's nothing alleged about what happened on that flight. Richard Thompson, the lawyer who had documented everything, spread out his notes. We have recorded evidence of 7 distinct discriminatory incidents during a 6-hour flight. The pattern is undeniable. The airline executives shifted uncomfortably as Thompson played back several of Captain Barrett's announcements, each one more damning than the last. The room fell silent as they listened to his thinly veiled comments about legitimate passengers and proper places. Just then, the door burst open. Captain Barrett strode in, still in his uniform, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. I was following security protocols." "Which protocols exactly?" Maya's voice cut through his bluster, calm and precise as a surgical instrument. "Please cite the specific airline policy that required you to single out one first-class passenger for repeated boarding pass checks and public humiliation." Barrett's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The young couple, Amy and James, pulled out their phones again, still recording. The captain's confidence seemed to deflate under the weight of so many witnesses. Marcus Williams, the tech executive, spoke up from his corner. "The internet is waiting for answers, too. This story has gone viral. Major news networks are picking it up. Your company's reputation is on the line." The airline's PR director, a woman named Jennifer Carter, cleared her throat. "We want to make this right, Dr. Richardson. Captain Barrett's actions do not reflect our company's values." "Stop right there," Maya interrupted, her voice firm but measured. "This isn't about company values or PR statements. This is about a systemic problem that needs systematic solutions." She opened her laptop, revealing a document she had drafted during the flight. "I have 3 non-negotiable requirements. First, a complete overhaul of your diversity training programs. Second, a clear system for reporting and addressing discrimination in real time. Third, meaningful consequences for staff members who violate these policies." The executives huddled together, whispering urgently. Captain Barrett stood alone now, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing realization of the severity of his situation. Sarah stepped forward, handing over a sealed envelope. This contained signed statements from every crew member on today's flight, detailing not just today's incidents but previous concerns about Captain Barrett's behavior. The airline's legal team looked increasingly worried as they reviewed the mounting evidence. The hashtag respect in the skies had reached over 1 million tweets. News vans were gathering outside the terminal. "Dr. Richardson," Thomas Wright spoke again, his tone notably different now. "We would like to propose an additional solution. Would you consider heading a new advisory board on passenger dignity and rights?" Before Maya could respond, Captain Barrett exploded. "This is absurd. I've been flying for 30 years. And in one flight, you managed to demonstrate exactly why this change is necessary," Maya replied calmly. The room fell silent again. First Officer Chen finally spoke up. "I've requested a formal review of all passenger complaints from Captain Barrett's previous flights. The pattern goes back years." The airline executives exchanged glances, then nodded. Thomas Wright pulled out an official document. "Dr. Richardson, we're prepared to meet all your requirements. Additionally, we want to implement immediate changes to our training and reporting systems." Maya looked around the room, at Sarah's proud smile, Mrs. Peterson's determined nod, the young couple's hopeful expressions, and the businessman's satisfied grin. What had started as a routine flight had become a catalyst for real change. As she prepared to sign the agreement, Maya's phone buzzed with a reminder about tomorrow's surgery. She was still Dr. Maya Richardson, neurosurgeon, but now she was also becoming something more, a voice for change in an industry that desperately needed it. Captain Barrett slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his era of unchecked behavior was over. The world was changing, and he had just become an expensive lesson in why it needed to. 1 week after the flight incident, Maya sat in her office at Los Angeles Memorial Hospital, reviewing patient files. Her successful surgery from the day after on her desk, newspapers carried bold headlines. "Airline announces major policy changes after first-class discrimination incident, and captain's actions lead to industry-wide examination of bias." Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with interview requests from major networks. Sarah, the flight attendant who had stood by her, had just texted, "You won't believe what happened." The airline just announced mandatory monthly diversity training for all staff. Captain Barrett has been suspended pending investigation. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. James Wilson, the hospital's chief of staff. Dr. Richardson, have you seen this? He held up a tablet showing a video that had gone viral, a compilation of Captain Barrett's discriminatory comments during the flight, interspersed with passenger testimonies. The video has over 10 million views, he said, sitting down across from her. But more importantly, other airlines are starting to review their own policies. You've started something big. Maya's phone buzzed again. This time it was Richard Thompson, the lawyer from the flight. Settlement paperwork is ready, his message read. The airline has agreed to all terms, including the establishment of the Passenger Rights Advisory Board with you as chairperson. The young couple, Amy and James, had turned their social media documentation into a powerful mini-documentary that was being shared by civil rights organizations nationwide. Their hashtag #RespectInTheSkies had evolved into a movement, with passengers sharing similar stories from various airlines. Mrs. Peterson had used her connections to arrange a meeting with the airline's board of directors. They're not just dealing with one incident now, she had told Maya. They're facing a complete overhaul of their corporate culture. Marcus Williams from Google had kept his promise. The tech community had rallied behind the cause, with several companies threatening to cancel their corporate contracts with airlines that didn't address discrimination issues seriously. First Officer Chen had been promoted to captain, replacing Barrett on several key routes. His first act was to implement a new reporting system for crew members to document discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Maya's office phone rang. It was Jennifer Carter, the airline's PR director. Dr. Richardson, we're ready to announce the new initiatives. Would you be willing to speak at the press conference next week? As Maya considered the request, her assistant brought in more messages. Other medical professionals had started sharing their own travel experiences, creating a powerful narrative about discrimination faced by professionals of color. The airline industry was paying attention. 3 other major carriers had already reached out to consult with Maya about their own diversity policies. What had started as one incident was becoming a catalyst for systemic change. Sarah had been promoted to lead flight attendant trainer, specifically focusing on handling discrimination incidents. She sent Maya photos of the new training materials, which included case studies from their flight. Maya's mother called, her voice full of pride. "Baby, you're not just changing minds, you're changing systems. Your father would have been so proud." The hospital board had been supportive, adjusting Maya's surgery schedule to allow her to participate in the airline's reform initiatives. They recognized that this work was as important as her medical practice. It was about healing a different kind of wound. Captain Barrett had tried to make a public apology, but his statement had only highlighted the depth of the problem. "I was just following protocols," he claimed, unable to see how his actions reflected deep-seated bias. Looking out her office window at the Los Angeles skyline, Maya reflected on how one flight had turned into a movement. She hadn't asked for this role, but she was embracing it with the same precision and care she brought to her surgeries. Her phone buzzed one more time, a message from an unknown number. It was from a young black girl who had seen the viral video. "Thank you for standing up. I want to be a pilot someday, and now I know I can." Maya smiled, thinking about how a moment of discrimination had transformed into an opportunity for lasting change. Tomorrow, she would return to the operating room, saving lives one surgery at a time. But she had also helped start a different kind of healing, one that would impact countless lives in the sky. The incident hadn't just exposed one captain's bias, it had revealed an entire system in need of repair. And Maya Richardson, neurosurgeon and now inadvertent activist, was helping to fix it, one policy change at a time. 1 month after the flight incident, Maya stood at a podium in the airline's corporate headquarters, addressing a room packed with executives, media representatives, and aviation industry leaders. The moment felt surreal, a stark contrast to that tense state in first class. Today marks not just a policy change, but a fundamental shift in how we address dignity and respect in air travel, Maya began, her voice steady and clear. Behind her, a large screen displayed the airline's new comprehensive anti-discrimination program. In the front row sat familiar faces: Sarah, now heading the airline's new passenger advocacy division; Mrs. Peterson, recently appointed to the airline's board of directors, and the young couple, Amy and James, whose documentary had won a journalism award. Richard Thompson stood near the back, smiling proudly. His law firm had helped draft the new industry guidelines that were being adopted by airlines across the country. The settlement had become a template for institutional change. In the past month, Maya continued, we've received over 10,000 stories from passengers and crew members. Each one represents an opportunity for improvement, for learning, and for change. First Officer Chen, now Captain Chen, nodded from his seat. Under his leadership, the airline had implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, with clear consequences and reporting procedures. Marcus Williams from Google had kept his promise too. A coalition of tech companies had created an app for real-time reporting of discrimination incidents across all airlines, with direct links to corporate accountability teams. The changes were tangible: mandatory quarterly diversity training for all staff, an independent review board for passenger complaints, and a scholarship program for minority students entering aviation careers. Captain Barrett's story had reached its conclusion too. After a thorough investigation revealed a pattern of similar incidents, he had chosen early retirement over termination. His case had become a teaching example in the airline's new training programs. Maya's phone buzzed quietly, a message from her mother. Watching you live on TV, baby. You're changing the world, one flight at a time. The hospital where Maya worked had noticed changes too. More medical professionals were speaking up about their travel experiences, leading to special protocols for healthcare workers traveling for emergency procedures. Sarah stepped up to the podium next, presenting data from the first month of the new programs. Incident reports were down, crew morale was up, and passenger satisfaction scores had reached record highs. This isn't just about one flight or one captain, Sarah explained. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels safe and respected at 35,000 feet. The young black girl who had dreamed of becoming a pilot was in attendance too. Maya had arranged for her to meet several female pilots and begin a mentorship program. Her bright eyes showed the promise of a new generation. Mrs. Peterson took the microphone to announce a new scholarship foundation in her late husband's name, specifically designed to support diversity in aviation leadership roles. As Maya concluded her speech, she shared one final thought. What happened on that flight could have ended with just one complaint, one incident report. Instead, it became a catalyst for industry-wide transformation. The applause was thunderous, but Maya's mind was already on her next surgery scheduled for tomorrow. She had learned to balance both roles: healer of bodies and advocate for change. Richard Thompson approached her after the ceremony. You know, Dr. Richardson, what you've accomplished here will affect millions of travelers for years to come. The media coverage was extensive, but Maya's favorite headline came from a small industry journal: How One Doctor's Flight Changed Aviation's Culture. As she left the building, Maya passed a wall of photographs showing the airline's history. A new addition caught her eye: a photo of that first-class cabin from her flight, with all the passengers standing in solidarity. Sarah caught up with her in the lobby. We've had 3 other airlines request our new training materials just this week, she reported excitedly. This is becoming the new standard. Maya's phone buzzed one last time, a reminder about tomorrow's surgery. She smiled, knowing that her work in both medicine and advocacy would continue. Each role was about healing, just in different ways. As she stepped into the bright sunlight, Maya thought about how a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement for change. The skies were becoming friendlier, not just for her, but for everyone who would follow. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. But now, thanks to the courage of one doctor and the solidarity of strangers on a flight, the path forward was clearer than ever before.